You're listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense with your host, Doug Thorpe. Here's Doug.
Well, hello again, everyone. This is Leadership Powered by Common Sense, and I'm your tour guide, Doug Thorpe. Today, we're going to delve into the area of supply chain risk and environmental. My guest is an expert in that field. She's spent a career building software to help companies manage such risk, and we are going to touch on our old friend AI that is looming out there for many. So without any further ado, I want to introduce Katie Tamblin. Katie, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me.
And Katie is currently residing in near London and has been there for a number of years, expat status, I guess. And but give us a little bit of your background, Katie, and your journey that got you here.
Sure. And you're absolutely right. So I grew up in the US. I started working as an economist in Washington, D.C. decades ago, and then was moved to London by the company that I worked for, which was then called Global Insight. It's now part of S&P. So I moved to London. I set up a team of economists and moved. Not long after that, we were acquired. And with that acquisition, I moved into more of a product management role. And I worked on our first development of a web platform. I mean, that's how old I am. We were building our first web platform in my job, and I just fell in love with it. I fell in love with the marriage of data and technology, and these new ways of presenting the information that we used to sell as books, as economists, as books and tables, into something online and something that people could search and consume in different ways. So I spent the majority of my career building software to deliver forecasts and advice and business analysis to help companies manage supply chain risk, and as you say, ESG and risk in their environmental impact as well.
And talk about the book you wrote.
So I wrote a book, and it was forged out of deep, cathartic process of working on these software projects. And I worked on quite a few. And I just found there were these common factors. And I started writing a series of essays about some of the commonalities I saw. And I used to joke in one of my roles as a chief product officer for a supply chain risk and compliance company. I used to joke with my colleagues. I said, look, when I'm done with this software project, I'm going to write a book and I'm going to call it The Chunky Corporate. It's going to be about the opposite of lean startups and why we struggle so much with software development. And so the way the book evolved, I really meant it as a joke at the time. But when I finished that role, I started writing these essays. And I started writing stuff down as a way to process it and try to figure out, why did these software projects always end up late and fraught with missteps and errors and problems and unforeseen challenges? And in my kind of catharsis and my talking with other people, I started to really think deeply and analyze these things. And I remember a former colleague of mine saying, well, I always just thought Agile was a way of telling your board there's no fixed budget and no timeline. And I thought, he's on to something. And so the book title evolved from just calling it The Chunky Corporate to The Lean Agile Dilemma, because what I discovered is that lean agile, the way that leaders bat those terms around, carries great meaning for their software engineers. And I think quite often what's happening is there's this disconnect between business leaders saying that I want us to be lean, I want us to be more agile, and what that actually means to software engineers. And actually, I think what business leaders often want, especially at mature tech-enabled businesses, is predictable performance, what is not what Lean Agile was written for. It was written for innovation, finding new markets, finding product market fit. So I wrote the book to try to talk about and explain those differences so that business leaders could get a deeper understanding of why so many of these software projects are fraught with challenges and what we can do to help avoid those challenges, or at least understand and prepare for them.
As you say that, I'm thinking of a case experience that I had. There was an organization, and I've got to be very delicate here. I'm not going to name names, but I was brought in to coach some senior leaders who were tasked with implementing Agile in this organization. And it was an organization in an industry that you would not think they were not talking about software development. They were talking about operating their company that way.
Mhm.
And I listened to the attempt to adopt all the vocabulary and all the structure and framework. And they were talking about tribes and communities and sprints and all these things, and I'm going, your industry doesn't operate that way. And I believe I have somewhat lost touch with the organization. That was several years ago. I think they abandoned the effort, but I think, to your point, I think it was potentially some board members, or at least senior executives, that read some books and thought, well, this could work for us, even though, again, their primary mission was not technology development. It was a whole different service-based business. And I thought, wow, this is quite interesting that somebody tried to rob this idea and apply it in a pretty much, inappropriate way.
I think that's so common, and it speaks to the value. The Agile Manifesto, as it was originally written for software development, and the Lean Startup, as it was originally written for entrepreneurs, are fantastic resources. They're absolutely amazing, and I think the desire to apply them everywhere is a testament to how wonderful they are. But what I is about early, young, immature companies trying to find a product market fit. And so the companies for which that book was written don't have much access to capital. They don't really need to have defined timelines because they haven't got that much oversight. They don't have much reliance on process. They're seeking funding, and they're focused on innovation. So they can apply those principles, and Agile works really well for them because Agile, as you rightly say, is based on tribes, it's based on small groups of people working together. When people try to scale those for a number of reasons, you contrast a chunky corporate to a lean startup. Their access to capital, unlike a lean startup, is high usually. If they're a mature business and they've been successful, they have more resources, they have deeper pockets. With those deeper pockets comes oversight. So their desire to do things on a defined timeline is higher because the people overseeing it, the people who have opened their pockets to that organization, want to know what's happening and when, because they're probably looking to sell or bring in other investment on relatively defined timelines. So therefore the oversight is high. That means their reliance on process needs to be higher. They've got more people, more resources, more people, more relationships to manage. And process is often introduced in these organizations to help lots of people do the same thing in a way that's predictable. And so that just creates very different working environments. And so for a chunky corporate to deliver these large projects, really, I find that their focus needs to be on managing those relationships. You think about a lean startup that's 10 people or less, that's a few hundred relationships to manage in between those 10 people maximum. You think about a larger organization with a few hundred employees, they have thousands of relationships. They could spend all day, every day communicating and still not get anything, accomplished. So it just is about where you focus and recognizing that actually, if you're investor backed, you probably are more focused on execution and predictable performance than innovation and, less process and more entrepreneurial kind of inventing, if that makes sense.
Well, and I think where the friction happens is as companies do get bigger, even at the top of the house, they sort of start wishing for the old days where they felt more entrepreneurial, more nimble, more able to quickly adapt and quickly change. So there's often a little bit of an effort to sort of retool and go back to the entrepreneurial spirit. But yet, to your point, there's a different kind of accountability that's being monitored and expected, particularly, as you say, if outside investors have been brought in and they've got their own idea of performance and outcome. So it's a trade-off that is not always easy to do, and I think people do in fact maybe spend careers trying to figure that out, and get that entrepreneurial spirit back into a chunky organization.
Absolutely. And I think it's something that's really important, but it needs to be understood as how it works within or alongside the kind of daily running of the business. And it's so funny you mentioned this transition and this recognition that some leaders have, and this kind of tension they have between wanting to go back to their entrepreneurial roots. And that's something I observed many, many times in my career as I worked at acquisitive companies, was kind of the founder mentality of a founder coming into a large organization and what happens to that founder. And I never really thought about it in much depth until my husband went through it while I was writing the book. He sold his company and went from being an entrepreneur and a founder into a much larger company that relied on process and board oversight. And just like so many founders I've worked with, found that really difficult. And it was another one of these moments that really compare and contrast lean startup with chunky corporate from one day to the next. And we used to laugh that management is watching someone else do your old job worse than you would. And that's how I think so many founders feel. They're no longer able to be across everything. They're no longer doing everything. Now their primary way that they spend their time, once they're, kind of subsumed into these larger organizations, either through organic growth or through acquisition, they're spending all their time telling their board what's happening in the business. And so instead of doing, they're communicating. And that's a really difficult transition a lot of times for entrepreneurs that loved the doing. That's why they got into it in the first place. Loved the building and all of that.
Well, yeah, you're talking about the classic founderitis that can be a positive experience, or it can be negative if for the individual that wants to stay buried in the weeds a little too much. That's prohibitive for the growth of that entrepreneurial enterprise. But you're right, there's a tipping point of still having that fire in the belly to be that entrepreneur and that driver to create something. And that can get stifled in a corporate environment because there's budgets and there's plans, and you don't just wake up one day with a great idea that you want to go turn on. And you've to a degree, you've got that freedom in a purely entrepreneurial setting. So that is a challenge. Well, let's bring up, as we touched on in the green room when we were kind of getting ready. What about AI in the face of all this that's going on?
It's a great question, and it's one I get asked a lot, especially over the last 12 months with just the amount. I mean, I have seen a huge change in the way software engineers and product teams are working with this amazing development of AI. And I think, I know because I'm seeing it firsthand, AI is accelerating the way in which we prototype, accelerating how we write requirements for software development. And it's going to help us be more productive. I think there's no doubt about it. But it is not a panacea. It is not going to take over building all of this software, especially in mature organizations, anytime soon. And there's a number of reasons for that. Where I have seen it deployed successfully, it's typically in prototyping or new product builds, because AI can significantly accelerate how quickly you build a new platform. And I've seen that happen. However, most mature organizations aren't building new platforms so much as they are tweaking, maintaining, or reworking existing platforms. And that is an area, what we call replatforming. It's not just a name. And AI really struggles with that because and engineers who didn't build the original platform really struggle with that. It's like picking up someone else's half-done work and trying to finish it.
Mm-hmm.
because if you don't know how it was built in the first place, if you don't have that institutional knowledge, it's really hard to come in and understand it. So that's one key reason in which replatforming is difficult, and one thing that presents a challenge. I'm sure AI will continue to evolve and get better at that, but that's an area where I've seen AI not really be able to add as much productivity as one would hope. The other is that replatforming involves data, and data is not mentioned in Agile or in the Lean Startup. And the main reason for that is because it's not really relevant in new software builds. So if you're building new software, you don't typically have a ton of data to work with because data is generated as the software is used. So similar to how AI is great for building new prototypes and new small applications, it is not very well trained on how to manage data, simply because data is sticky and messy and legacy and complex. I'm sure it will continue to improve, but those are the two things I think that are making it a challenge for engineering teams to truly just go, right, let's fire all the engineers, all the product owners, and use AI. The last thing I should mention on the topic is that building software, especially at large organizations, is human. It's a human enterprise. And the quality of the software that is built is going to be only as good as the quality of the communication between the individuals, the people who know what they want, that know what's going to work, and the people actually writing the code. And the same as you can put AI in that mix, but the software you get is still going to be only as good as the prompt you give the AI. And so it depends entirely on who's giving the prompts and who understands how it can work. So I think it introduces another communication challenge alongside the ones we already see of people trying to work in large organizations across silos.
Yeah, and on that note, I still see it to this day, and I'm a little bit like you. I've been in the business world long enough. I was there when we put the first desktop computers in our offices and got away from the mainframes. And I've seen a lot of evolution on that. But in terms of developing new solutions, there's always the age-old bridge between the user community and the technologists that are building. And in many cases, still to this day, there's a huge gap in the middle, and there's no strong, viable bridge. And, the classic solution is a business analyst sitting in the middle to hear what the user community wants, translate that into requirements that are written in the technology speak so the technologists know what they need to go do. And you still have this cultural divide, I think I'll go so far as to call it that, between the way your classic technology guys think and act and do versus what the user community wants. And, it can be exponentially more complex depending on what that user environment is. And classic example is a sales organization says, we've tried every CRM on the market. None of them work. Here's what we really need. And companies commit to commissioning a custom built CRM platform, and it spirals wildly out of control because the sales guys are just vehement about what they need and very passionate and emotional, but they don't know the language to speak to get the technologists to develop that. And the technologists are willing. It's just tell me what you really need, and they never hear it. So, the project goes on and on and on, languishes. You might get a prototype, and then everybody says, oh, this first version is a total fail. We got to start over. And so it goes.
Yeah, I mean, that you just described at least 3 or 4 software projects I've worked on. And there's 2 things I think that are really interesting and so common. One is what you said exactly, which is can I explain to the people configuring my CRM system or building my custom one what it is I actually want? And the second, and I'll come back to that one, but the second is at what point can I switch over from what I've already got to the new? So we had a project that went on and on and on and on and on because we had a system, a CRM system already in place. And the business leaders at our organization were worried, if you flip from old to new, that's going to kill our sales productivity, maybe only for a week, maybe 2 weeks while people get used to the new system. But that still takes, half of our month out. We can't afford that. So we cannot go live with the new software until it is absolutely perfect. That's the opposite of agile. That is a waterfall project. That is a type of software development that was scrapped in the 80s, right? Or early 90s. So that is where agile, and I remember the engineers being like, stop telling me to be agile and then telling me you're not going to use the darn thing until it's perfect. It's like that really makes engineers' brains want to explode. And is why I've kind of in the book drafted an in-between, something that's not quite agile, it's not quite waterfall, but it marries these conflicting priorities together in mature organizations. But the other that I think is so funny that comes back to communication is the point that you raised, which is how do we just communicate, and how do we get our colleagues to understand that communication is going to be the greatest challenge? We played this great game at a conference one year where we had the sales team and the engineers all in one room. And at one end of the room, we had a picture of a house, and we had a product owner with his back to that picture, so he couldn't see the picture, and a big easel with a blank sheet of paper and a marker. And we had the salespeople in the room describe the house for him. It has a chimney, it has 4 windows, it has this, and he was drawing it, not being able to see the picture. And at the end, and the salespeople couldn't see what he was drawing. So at the end, we said, right, salespeople, do you think you have told him everything you need to know about the house? Are you going to get the house you want? And when he turned around and revealed his picture, you could see it looked nothing like what they were describing. And I felt like that exercise was such a fantastic way of showing people about to embark in this project, that how good the outcome, how good the software you get is going to completely depend on how well you describe what you want.
Yeah.
And it's so much harder than you think it's going to be.
Well, and then I know in my own experience, there's one more layer that again adds some exponential complexity to this. And back to your point about data, when you, even if you're starting from scratch, when you start envisioning how the data is going to be accumulated and processed, you have all these, and again, in my day, we called them business rules. It's the if this happens, I need to go touch these 10 data points. I need to do updates or modifications or adjustments. And you start layering all that in, and it's, and you get into well, wait a minute, what if 2 users are simultaneously viewing that data point? Who has control of it? And it goes on and on and on, and it gets into very minute requirement definitions that have to get coded. They have to be accounted for in the flow of the system. And when you miss those, all of a sudden now you've got this mess on your hands, and the data that you hope for is no longer valid. It's being corrupted accidentally or unintentionally by bad code. And again, it comes down to requirements, but every requirement has a processing aspect to it. So it really is a huge challenge.
Yeah. And I mean, I've worked on a number. The challenge I have is I keep getting brought into these projects when they're starting to derail. And one of the reasons I wrote the book is I was like, please just read the book before you start the project so we can avoid them going off the rails. And or at least avoid the mistakes that, are kind of other organizations have experienced. And one of those is every software project I have worked on that starts with engineers gathering requirements. The assumption is we're going to build the software, and then we're going to grab any data from legacy platforms that software is replacing, and we're going to put the data in the new software. I have yet to work on a project where someone comes along and says, you know what, we've got 6 legacy systems that we're trying to integrate because we've acquired 5 companies. Go get the data from those 6 systems and get it all cleaned, aligned, and combined into a single data set and then build me a new platform around that. But that's the order, frankly, I think it should go, because in 90% of the projects I've worked on, when you do the software first and then you bring the data in, something in the code, to your point, either messes up the data, or the data aren't displayed, or the data aren't in the right format. And that stuff doesn't come out. And I find that one of the common challenges, people do this at the last minute. The data is an afterthought because it's engineers running the project and they think software, data will figure itself out. And I came from a data background. So when I first started working in software, I kept saying to our engineers, like, no, you need to think about the data first. Trust me, this is going to cause problems. And it does. I've seen it add 2 to 3 years to software projects. And it's the silliest little stuff that you just don't think about. Once we were trying to integrate, a US database with a European database, and honestly, you would not believe the amount of time it took to sort out the date, whether the day or the month comes first. It's like that. You feel like that's a pretty simple solution to solve, but it's these tiny little things that if you don't catch it till it's in the software, then you don't know how many places. You will spend months trying to find all the different places that it's got the date reversed. It's whereas if you just get the data aligned first and you recognize, there's a misalignment in this data, so we've got to get it aligned first. And then we know, hey, coders, anytime you're coding date, it needs to be in this format. You can avoid that problem, and it'll take a lot less time.
And you're talking to a guy that lived through the Y2K debacle.
A whole nother story in and of itself, no doubt.
And for those of you listening that are maybe too young to know, but there was great fear when we were turning the millennial and going to the year 2000, because so much code had been written with just a 2-digit year frame. And finding all those date instances and where code was adjusting dates or processing dates, it was a big deal. And there were those who, there were those who were sure that whole infrastructures would collapse, in banking and finance and oil and gas and many other really significant industries, but it didn't. We all got through it.
Find a way to muddle through.
But I lamented not going that path. A lot of the guys that went down that path as so-called experts in the conversion made a lot of money during that time.
No doubt. Absolutely. I mean, there was a whole industry that popped up around solving that problem, for sure.
Yeah, but massive. So, I guess I'm going to ask you, Katie, do you have a crystal ball? Where are we going with all this? Where are people going to land eventually?
I wish I had a crystal ball. I think the name of the game is constant evolution and focus on communication. I think the teams that really focus on the relationships and the communication will see that acceleration that technology inevitably brings, and be able to benefit from that acceleration much more effectively than those that do not appreciate that the larger your organization, the more you have to focus on communication and relationships. I think one of the biggest challenges we have is that our ability to communicate effectively as colleagues is being challenged by working from home, by constant meetings, and by the generational shifts in our ability to just sit down and work through things. So I don't know where we'll end up. I know there will be companies that manage this evolution well, and there will be companies that don't. I think one of the biggest challenges that larger, more mature organizations will face as we evolve and as technology evolves is that it's going to be easier for startups to compete, because they'll be able to build new software and they'll be faster in their prototyping and faster in their evolution than they ever have been before with the advent of AI. And so I think it'll keep those mature organizations on their toes and surely prompt them to improve.
Well, to play off that, I have frequently spoken, and I certainly talked to all of my clients about this in terms of people in seats of leadership and authority trying to guide and steer these organizations. To your point on the communication, I think clarity is the key word that I often, really encourage my people to think about. You as a leader, if you get sucked into the vortex of thinking, the more you talk in industry slang and jargon and complexity, the more authoritative and informed you sound. Well, guess what? Exactly the opposite is happening. You are likely confusing those around you more than you're proving your worth. So I encourage people to really peel a lot of that away and try to help people understand. If you have a vision of moving from point A to point B, say it. Just what is point A today? What is point B tomorrow? And don't encumber it with all of the technical junk that might be out there. It might be totally accurate in technical speak. And unless you're talking to a team of technologists that have to know that part of it, your average team only gets confused. And there's a line out of the sales playbook that says a confused mind says no. If you're the salesman and you're just dumping function, feature, and process on a client and you see them glass over, you just lost the sale. And so same thing, I believe, applies in leadership. If you're going to be leading a team, when you see anybody with any hint of doubt on their face, even if it's through a virtual meeting, you need to stop and say, what about what we just said do you not understand? And I'm not being critical. I want to be helpful. Let's peel away what we need to peel away to get to the understanding we need.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think it speaks volumes to, the anecdote you shared before about people wanting to apply agile wherever, is because it was a buzzword. And I think, I would add to what you're saying there. If you're a leader and you're not fully versed on all of the ins and outs of the technical jargon that you want to use because you've heard it used elsewhere, or you've, read a book, to be very careful about using it, because you may not be aware of the meaning it holds for others. So clarity in what you say, and as you rightly say, like stripping out any of that technical jargon you don't need, but also clarity into the connotations of the words that you use, whether those words are lean and agile or whether they're different words. I think we often underestimate all of the assumptions that our colleagues have around the use of certain terms. And so we need to achieve clarity, you really need to be able to dig into that. And I think your example of asking, if someone looks confused or furrows their brow or seems to not understand, encourage them and give them a safe space to ask, because they might enlighten you into something you had no idea. That, data experts use that word this way, and, people in the US use it that way, and people in South Africa use it a different way. And, there's all these different ways we can miscommunicate.
Right. Well, Katie, this has been great. Tell people the best way to get a hold of you if they'd like to know more about your work.
So the book's available on Amazon and major booksellers. You can go to katietamblin.com if you want to read more, if you want to reach out to me and have a conversation about it. I'd love to hear from anyone in your audience.
Well, great. And as always, folks, we will have those links in the show notes. So hop down there and check it out if you are interested. And I do like to remind you, we've got a video version of this show over on YouTube, channel by the same name, Leadership Powered by Common Sense. Check out the archives and give us a comment. Let us know if you've got an idea for another topic or a guest you'd like to see. Would love to hear from you. But with that, we're going to wrap up, say goodbye. Go out there and make it a great day.
You've been listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense, hosted by Doug Thorpe. If you would like to know more about the coaching and advisory services he provides, visit dougthorpe.com.